in a very extensive way. And I can talk about the TRIPS and so forth. Now, a few years ago, Robert Zelig, who was the president of the World Bank, now isn't it very interesting that the president of the World Bank is always from America, and the president of the IMF is always from Europe. So you can see how power reproduces itself in that regard. Robert Zelig, who was the president of the World Bank, said there's no longer a third world. He said, because look at all these third world countries, look at China, it is so successful. Look at India, there are many rich people now in India. So he said this whole idea of the third world is nonsense. Everyone is benefiting. But what I find interesting now is almost, I would make the reverse argument. I would say that the third world is everywhere. And this is why President Trump became President Trump. In other words, it is no longer the case that these systems operate only against people in the non-European world. These systems also operate against poor people living in the West itself. Does that make sense? So the third world might have begun as the non-European world. But now, with this structure of expanding and unfair international economic law, what we find is a system where people in the West themselves are suffering and becoming marginalized. So yesterday I talked about austerity measures. And I said it's interesting now that austerity measures are now found in the West. Before, austerity measures were imposed on the non-European countries, on African countries or Asian countries. Now you find a similar system being imposed on Western countries like Greece. So Greece has gone through a very difficult time in these circumstances. So this is simply to say that there has been a lot of dissatisfaction and impoverishment in the West itself. And that has led to a huge amount of discontent. And that discontent is often the source of support for people such as the strong man who says, if you vote me into power, I will fix everything. And we see many countries in the world now who are choosing leaders who basically say, if you vote for me, I'll fix everything, don't worry. Because the complications of international economic law are very technical. It's difficult for people to understand. What they do understand is that they cannot earn a living anymore. And that they are afraid that their children's futures are going to be affected. And so what we find now is it is as though the West itself is becoming like the third world. And so you see in the United Kingdom, Brexit, the attempt to detach from globalization, and an attempt to recover sovereignty. So the feeling now is that sovereignty is being lost in all these different ways. So I suppose the argument we would make now is that 12 is, in a sense, a universal theory. It is not a theory that applies only to the people in the non-European world. It is a theory which also applies to people in the West who are going through these difficulties. And it is very interesting if you look at the works of Western scholars. Some of you might have heard of Samuel Moyn. Wrote a very influential book recently about human rights and inequality. And he said human rights, his argument is that human rights does not deal with the problem of inequality. Now the point is that third world scholars were saying that 20 years ago. If you look at the work of Upendra Bakshi, he said that 30 years ago. He said human rights cannot deal with inequality. But when third world scholars were making these arguments, the West said, oh, they're just being radical. Now, my colleague at the National University of Singapore, his name is Professor Sonaraja, 30 years ago he was saying foreign investment law is a law that is created to protect the rights of corporations. In fact, it is a continuation, I would argue, of Grotius. So that's another whole story. Foreign investment law and international arbitration. But when Professor Sonaraja made this argument about 30 years ago, people said he's a third world radical. You don't have to listen to him. Now it's very interesting that it is the European Union that is looking critically at investment arbitration. They have launched a whole project saying we don't want investment arbitration. So can we see that now what happened to the third world is happening to other countries as well, in the West itself. And of course, it has to be said, interestingly enough, I can't help feeling that Europe is afraid of China, of Chinese investments being protected by these systems of investment arbitration. So it was okay when Western investment was protected in non-European countries. But now there's been a shift in the international system of power, and so it is as though those particular legal regimes that were used against the third world can be used against the West itself. And at that point of time, the European Union says, we want to rethink the whole investment arbitration system. And so there's a lot of discussion now about what the investment arbitration system should be. But can we see again, it is the argument made by third world scholars 30 years ago, which are now being revived by the West itself. So that is what I mean when I say it is the third world analysis that really helps us understand how this process of impoverishment actually took place and why we need a different system to the one that exists at the moment. Okay, I've spoken for long enough, so I look forward to your comments and thoughts. Thank you. Hi, sure. Am I moderating? Okay, sure.
Yeah, obviously. Thank you very much for your speech. I'm a student from Peking University and I'm studying international law, a master's degree. And you're talking about the colonialism still continues nowadays, but as the structure that you gave us, that the dynamic of the differences, right? So I think it might be better than to describe some unequal phenomenon in the world now to explain some unequal phenomenon in the world. I think it's better to use the differences rather than colonialism to explain that.
Sure.
Is that right?
Perhaps. So my argument is that colonialism is the historical experience that creates this structure. So that's why I would say it still goes back to colonialism. We might say, okay, let's get rid of colonialism, just talk about difference. But I feel that it's helpful to understand the origins, where this comes from, because if we look at the origins, we might also see that there are variations in this dynamic of difference. And if we see when, it's like a person, right? Now, one thing that struck me about China is that it's very important where people come from, and you can trace your history back like 10 generations, correct? So it's a little like that with colonialism. If you can trace the beginnings of this phenomenon, it is helpful in helping us understand the phenomenon and how it might operate, because it might operate in different ways. And again, this goes back to how we should view the history of international law. So one idea of the history of international law is that it's a history of progress, that one thing changes and then there's continuous improvement. We can go from sovereignty to human rights to women's rights to the responsibility to protect, to international criminal law. All these things represent progress. Another view of international law is to say it goes in cycles. And maybe that's a useful way of looking at international law now, isn't it? Because we seem to be going into a phase where sovereignty is very important again. Nationalism and sovereignty. Because in the 1990s, it was all about globalization. Sovereignty is irrelevant, correct? So everyone, it's one big happy world. But now sovereignty is coming back. So in other words, you can see international law as being cyclical. Sovereignty wanes and then sovereignty comes back. And we are in the phase where sovereignty is coming back. Now my theory about the history is that international law is like a huge, how should I say? It's a huge catalog of techniques. And those techniques can emerge at any time. So something that Grotius wrote in 1603 could suddenly be used again in 2018. And so the whole history of international law is always present. It is just that it suddenly emerges in a particular time. So that's why I think it's still useful, I would say, to understand the colonial background to this particular structure.
Well, I would say that maybe that colonialism is just a representation or manifestation of the difference between people, between different regions of the world that happens at that time. And for now, as you just mentioned, that even in the developing country, even in the Western country, the reason why that there are some, you see, they are against the globalism. It's because the differences are, the divergence is very clear and more obvious within their country.
Yeah.
So actually, I think the essence is the difference, like you said. So maybe it's just a different manifestation, different stages, and different under different context. So that's maybe I'm just thinking about your. Yeah.
Sure. No, I think that's a good point. I would say we also have to build into the idea of difference the idea of power. So it's not just difference in a neutral sense. It's not the difference between brown tea and green tea or something like that. Difference is often created artificially as an expression of power, because difference is created in order to say a people is inferior or people is in some respect less equal. Now, the interesting thing, of course, I'm just following up on your very interesting sort of suggestion. Of course, the argument is that in the West, there's no racial difference, right? But of course, I would say there is a racial difference. If you look at the way that immigrants are treated, or if the treatment of minorities. But there is also the issue about economics and class. So my colleague B.S. Chimney says we should not be thinking about rich countries and poor countries. We should be thinking about rich people and poor people. And maybe if we think about it in that way, that's the major difference. And so rich people can come from any society. And maybe they have lots of alliances among themselves. They all go to Ivy League schools together. They go from China and they go from India and all the rest of it. So that's the other story, perhaps the story of capitalism that we have to take into account in terms of understanding the difference. But race still matters, I would say.
Thank you.
Clearly you're not satisfied, but we'll talk about it. Sure.
Thank you, Professor. My question is that the reason that the non-European countries' traditional world order, like Chinese tribute system or the Confucian rites, does not apply to the contemporary world is because its inherent deficiency or the dominant power of the Europe. In other words, if China conquered the world, just as hypothesis, will its traditional world order prevails the world as the Europeans' world did?
So the argument is, if China conquered the world, would international law be different?
Yes. Actually, my question is that what should be our view to the traditional, non-Europeans' world order? Or
I think we should be very careful about that, because many Asian societies are hierarchical. And so, do we want a world in which hierarchy is the principle, explicit hierarchy? Now, of course, in the West, they talk about equality, but in fact, there's massive hierarchy, but it's economic hierarchy.
yes.
But in Asian societies, it is status hierarchy.
Yes.
And I don't feel that this would be a particularly desirable system myself. So I think we have to be critical. In other words, we have to take what is best from the Western tradition. I don't want, as I said yesterday, I'm not arguing that we completely reject the Western tradition. I think there are many good things about the Western tradition. But we have to be selective and see how we can make the best things of that reality. And similarly, there are many good things about Asian traditions, maybe a focus on the common good more than the individual. My teacher, Judge Veeramantri, whom I mentioned yesterday, he talks about environmental indigenous people. In many societies, in Australia for example, they have a different relationship with the environment. They see the environment as part of their own personality. They don't see the environment as a commodity that is to be exploited. And I think we need that outlook now. Because I think, the irony about everybody turning into themselves and becoming more sovereign is that when it comes to the environment, we need international cooperation more than ever. I don't know how, this issue is understood here among all of you, but I think that is going to pretty much destroy the world, maybe in 10 or 15 years even. The effects of global warming are much more severe than was even expected. So I think, going back to your question, there are good things and bad things, and we have to decide what's good and bad, and that's a difficult process.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think the gentleman.
Professor, I'm a student of Peking University as well, and I really appreciate your idea that we should pay some attention to the international, regional legal system or international law in third world states. I believe the countries live in the same regions must share some common values, and they must, at least, they need to respect the domestic law of each other. But what if those laws in those regions do not respect the rights of their people? For example, there are a lot of examples that we can cite. For example, some Islamic countries, the women have a low status in those countries, and I believe the Indian as well. So what about those laws do not respect their rights? Should we learn something from the West or stick to our values? Because some of the values were incorporated into the domestic law. So how to deal with those problems?
Sure, it's a big problem, and that's why I said to the earlier question, we should not accept something just because it is authentically the tradition of that particular country, at least in my view. And here maybe I'm being Western, I don't know, in saying I think human rights matter. I think the idea of human dignity is an important idea. I think the idea of equality between men and women is an important idea. I don't think we should invade countries which have different ideas. But I do think as an international norm that we should continue to promote the idea of equality. I don't think we can force other countries to change their ways. It's not by force, but perhaps by example and by persuasion. But I do feel that to the extent the question is, should we give complete respect to sovereignty? I'm against that. Because the other thing I would say about colonialism is there's also a thing called internal colonialism. The way in which a state treats its minorities is also a form of colonialism. Because to those minorities, the actions of the state could be seen as alien imposition. And so 12 scholars, at least in my generation, are also very concerned about the state itself treating its minorities as though they were colonial subjects. So I do think that we need to try and promote the values of dignity and equality. So maybe I'm becoming the Yale school, I don't know. That's very alarming. After all that I'm ready to hear. No, and it's an imperfect idea, but maybe, I don't know, Professor Numa might have something to say. Certain ideas of trans-civilizational ideas about human well-being. So my teacher, as I said, Judge Veeramantri, he argued that every tradition has ideas of equality built into them. And we should actually focus on those ideas and try to promote them in various ways.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I'm a student in Peking University Law School, and you mentioned that in 1960s there was a optimism or enthusiasm towards international law. Third world believed that we can change the world order to a better one. But it failed, as you said, that third world approaches failed. But 30 years or 50 years later, the Europeans themselves realized that they are still third world too. And can we say that it indicates some changes in international legal order? And can we say that it might be a chance for us, for third world, to reshape or improve the legal order? Or can we say that the change may still be dominated by powers? Thank you.
Good. Again, wonderful questions from all of you. So here, I think in a way all of you have a better idea of this than I do. Because, you see, the problem in the 1960s and 70s is that third world countries did not have power. They had many new ideas about how to change the system, but they did not have power. Now, they thought they would have power because of numbers. They thought, we outnumber the West, so we can work through the United Nations to change the international law. But they were unsuccessful for various reasons. But now countries like China have power. So the interesting question is, how is China going to use that power? Will it try to change the international legal system? Or will it operate within the international legal system? Because now China is in a position to benefit from that international legal system. So China is in a position, now it's investing in many countries. I just read a story today about Australia is getting a little nervous because of the extent of Chinese investment. But China can now say, we want a bilateral investment treaty. And remember exactly what the West wanted in the past. China is in a position to use exactly that same technology. Can you see that? So the interesting question is, will China follow that path of using the same instruments developed by the West? Or will China say, no, we want a different approach? And perhaps in some respects, China has a different approach, which many countries appreciate. China's approach is, we are going to respect the sovereignty of an Asian country that we deal with. We are not going to prescribe human rights treaties. In the case of Sri Lanka would prefer to deal with China in many respects because European country, the EU says, we will give you trade concessions providing you sign 26 human rights treaties. I think it's 26, something like that. Whereas China doesn't make any such demands. China says, no, we respect your sovereignty. So that's a difference in many respects. Although I'm still concerned about the economic dimensions of all that, but that's another issue. So I think that's a very interesting question, and only the future will tell. And I don't know what you all feel as Chinese, because I think it is China that is going to bring about the change, if there is going to be a change. I don't know whether the infrastructure bank, whether that will be different from how different it is from the World Bank or the IMF. So I think that's a very interesting question, which all of you are in a great position to try and research and understand, I guess. I think there's a lot of scholarship being done on this, but I feel I don't really have a clear thoughts one way or another. What do you all think? Will China be different? Does it have a different idea of global justice? Or does it feel it will work through the system as it is?
I want to say
Sure.
about this. I'm just thinking about my first question and relating it with this question. So actually, I think why colonialism matters is from my understanding, from your learn from your explanation. Maybe colonialism matters because the way that people treat distinctive members, distinctive groups, is still remain, and that's why colonialism might still matters today. And as for would China be different? It depends on how China would treat different parts of the world, how China treat other countries. So it might be it's my further thoughts on that question, about this question.
So there's that to be seen. I think colonialism has two dimensions at least. One is the idea of certain people are inferior. The other aspect of colonialism, though, is a more economic aspect, which is we need resources. So we have to get those resources from somewhere. And in order to get those resources, that's when we might have to control other people and dominate other people. So I guess that's the other dimension of colonialism that we need to think about. Yeah.
This precious opportunity. My question is maybe a bit technical. You just said that what theory that Grotius used in 19th century may be used nowadays too, but the sources of international law has changed to Article 33 of 38 of the SAG statute. Yes, but how is that kind of an obstacle? Because in Grotius' era, the law of a religious law can be a sources, and natural law has the domination of international law. So, what would you please react to that? Thank you.
Sure. So, it's interesting how the teachings of these scholars suddenly emerge again. So, after 9/11, there was this huge anxiety, and then in the United States they started talking about preemptive self-defense. And then President Bush said, ancient scholars have argued in favor of preemptive self-defense. So suddenly President Bush is almost citing Grotius. And the argument is that even if you look at the UN Charter, remember Article 51 of the UN Charter says self-defense is an inherent right. In other words, if you talk about something as an inherent right, that is very similar to saying it is a natural law. Can you see that? So even our so-called modern sources incorporate within them all this. That's what I mean when I say the whole of history is always present. And then suddenly a moment comes when people pluck from that and say, here is the principle. Now, I would also say that in the case of Grotius, I would say that he placed property in many respects at the center of his whole system of jurisprudence. And I would argue, Article 38(1)(c), that's a pretty open category, general principles. If you look at investment arbitration, a lot of that arbitration focuses on Article 38(1)(c). And in many respects, what they are doing is consolidating an idea of property and the protection of property that is comparable in many respects to what Grotius was trying to do through his own approach in these types of circumstances. So I suppose, I won't say that it's as though people are quoting Grotius immediately, but there is something to be learned from him in terms of his technique and his whole approach to some of these issues. And I had a very interesting discussion with Moody in the taxi on the way here, and she raised a very interesting question. She said Chinese students are not at all interested in third world approaches. Like you all haven't heard of it at all. And she asked me, why is that? So I said, how do I know? I mean, I think I should ask all of you. So whether third world approaches is interesting or not. It's interesting that we, so I held a conference in Singapore, and Yifeng was kind enough to attend. So we had people from all over the world, from Latin America, from Africa, even from Europe and Australia. But I don't think we had many people from China apart from yourself. So he's the aberration. So it's interesting, that. So I have to ask the question, and given that Professor Wang had this tradition, what has happened in China? What do you all see as the inspiration? What is the model you want to follow? Okay, I go around the table. I ask, who is your favorite international lawyer? Who is your inspiration? You? Okay, we'll start with you.
Who's my favorite international lawyer? Actually, I don't know. I don't know many international lawyers. Yeah, I read some books, but it's very hard for me to figure out to pick one that I like most because.
So who did you read?
Oh.
Sorry,
one.
Sorry, I should put you on the spot like this, right? So yeah, but don't feel that you have to answer. But yeah, if you.
Because I heard that people are colored by our background. I don't know. When I read books, I think that I know so little about the lawyer's nationality and his country's history.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm restricted and constrained by his standing. Sometimes I feel.
But who's standing? Like, which names are you thinking of? You don't need to know their nationalities, but you know, which books or is there someone who, when you read an article? Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot. So anyway, it's a general question, if you know what I mean. Like, who do you all read? Who do you look to for instruction?
Recently, I'm reading Professor Man's book, and I like it very much. And I think now he's my favorite.
Sorry, I haven't read that book. Which book is this?
Introduction to international law.
Professor
Wang铁崖.
All right. All right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, consider the as an inspiration. Well, you talk about the inspiration to me. While I was still very young, the Secretary General of the United Nations was Mr.
Kofi Annan.
Yeah. And I admire him very much because we all know that how much work, how much progress he made to promote the peace and security of the world. Right, a lot of mediation and a lot of negotiation that he did among the countries. So he was a great inspiration to me.
It's important to have those figures.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm interested in what sort of how should I say it? Do you all get a chance to read generally? Meaning, would you maybe I'm, maybe you all are too busy because you have to just focus on your classes. But whether any of you all read journals of international law just out of interest to see what articles are in those journals. Does that question make sense? Like, which international journals do you all know about?
European Journal of International Law.
Okay.
Yeah.
Others? Okay, but I'm glad. No, just to get a sense of where you all are coming from in terms of these issues. But I think there's another question here. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Anghie. I'm a student from Renmin University of China.
Okay.
My question concerning China's possible contribution to the reformation, maybe, of the modern international law right now. Because we may take the Belt and Road Initiative as one opportunity for China to play as a more positive role in the reformation of international law. Because recently I read something about international investment law and the poor situation of those indigenous peoples or minorities like in Latin American and African countries, where many scholars are pushing for a reformation of international investment law, maybe at the level of the BIT level or at the level of the dispute resolution level. Personally, I think when China, because right now Belt and Road Initiative is still an initiative, and the legal aspects concerning this initiative is still undergoing a formation, construction. I think when China
formulates its position.
Yes, with this initiative, maybe in terms of how China's corporations can invest abroad
Yeah.
when they are signing the ITs or renewing the ITs or signing like concession agreement by the corporation and the state. China can take an initiative to include some human rights protection into more concrete.
Sure. If they include those in the VITs, for example.
Yeah, I think this may be one of the possible ways. And also, I think I have one question for Professor Yu, because I've heard, I was also here yesterday and also today present here. I know that the third world states must do something to bring about a change to international law. And my question is more general, how? Thank you, Professor.
Yes. That's a big challenge in terms of how. I feel I can't easily think of any sort of recent third world initiatives. Because the other thing that has happened with the third world now is that in the 60s and 70s there was a relative unity among third world countries. And now it has fragmented. So there isn't even that in place. And so there is that difficulty. Maybe the initiatives can take place through something that we might think of as regional international law. You know, it might be easier because of a common culture in certain regions for particular countries in that region to come up with certain initiatives. So maybe ASEAN, for instance, might be in a position to make, you know, they're not trying to change the West or something like that. Or they might try, they might say, well, we are now in a position to, we're in a relatively powerful position because Western countries want to invest with us, so we can make use of that. So some scholars have been talking about what they call regional international law as a better alternative, not trying to make a particular system universal, that's too ambitious, but trying to achieve something, you know, or in a more sustainable way. So in Latin America, for example, they've got a very, you know, I think a relatively developed and impressive human rights system. So maybe that's the way to go in terms of making those sorts of changes.
Could I want to ask one question? Because we have characterized the international law as still very much the instrument for Colombia, and it continues in that way. And would this be the image that international law is bad in nature, or in structure, or in operation? And then, would that work in international be a hopeless project? And could we also make this distinction some good part of international law, some bad? So, I mean, would that characterization too sweeping? And would that be also how then we could leave room for our own endeavor and would that nature
agency?
Yeah.
Sure. So I feel ambivalent about, as I said, just as I said, there are many good things about the West. There are many bad things about Asia. Right? It's not as though everything Asian is good, everything Western is bad. It's much more complicated. And so what I would say that TWAIL offers is a way of understanding the operation of systems that would enable us to identify a situation where it has gone wrong. So I sometimes say it's a way of, it's a lens, it's a way of analysis. So it is something like a way of being precautionary in that regard. Now, some people would say international law is still relatively open. And so here we get Marty's argument about indeterminacy. So in other words, if you have the right person sitting on that investment arbitration tribunal, they can use exactly the same materials and decide the case in a different way. And do so in a legally coherent and plausible way. And that's where the grotious issue comes in, because then what we need are people who have a different vision. And I feel that my teacher, Judge Veeramantri, was like that. He had a very different vision, but he was also a brilliant lawyer. So he could use the legal instruments to present a very different vision, but he was using the same legal instruments that other people were using. Does that make sense? But in that context, what really matters is a few things, such as you have to be technically very good. You can't just say, I believe in justice, and here's my decision, right? You have to work with those legal materials and do so in a professional way. You also have to be very self-confident, because Judge Veeramantri was always dissenting. Right? But he had the courage to dissent. He felt he could stand up, and he could, in terms of his erudition and so forth. Because as a third world judge, he felt he should bring the experiences of the third world into his jurisprudence. I think there is a danger that many of us face, which is that we feel that in order to be accepted by the West, we have to get rid of our background, except to the extent that it is acceptable. Does that make sense? In other words, they would love to have a Sri Lankan as long as it's not Sri Lanka. Does that make sense? But Judge Veeramantri wasn't like that. So that's what I would say. He's an inspiration to me in terms of an example of somebody who tries to be true to his background and who tries to bring that vision into his international jurisprudence. Now, you could say, well, look at what happened to him. He was always dissenting, which means he was on the losing side. When he tried to go for re-election, there was an attempt to make sure he would not get re-elected. So you don't want. I think, by the way, that's changed now. I think a lot of you know now the experience of Judge Christopher Greenwood. So I think there are changes taking place, within the institutions. Also, in the International Law Commission, there's a young Indian, his name is Aniruddha Rajput, who suddenly got elected in front of all these very distinguished Europeans, right? Who were all shocked. They never thought that this would happen. So those things are taking place, and I would like to think that those people bring a different vision to bear in those international institutions. And so maybe that's something that we can hope for in the medium term, as it were. Everyone's exhausted. It's all been too much.
Professor, I want to ask you a very general question. I noticed that in Hong Kong, some young men argue that the colonialism
is a good thing.
Yeah, because the colonialism bring Hong Kong the rule of law.
Sure.
And make Hong Kong more advanced. My question is, do you think colonialism is a good thing for the third world in the past?
Oh my gosh. I don't know how to answer that, because I don't think colonialism was intended to sincerely to be good. But the simple fact is that people could make good out of it. In that context, here I am speaking English. I wouldn't have been speaking English if not for colonialism. I'm glad I can understand Shakespeare. That's a very rich experience. So I'm glad I had that opportunity. So I think that perhaps colonialism wasn't, in the end, whatever the profession, it wasn't intended to do good. I think the rule of law was created to protect property. And in a situation where the property was the property of the foreigners, they created the whole system. But later, the people themselves could use it in a way to benefit from it. I sometimes think of Australia, which I think is a great country in many respects. Australia began as a prison colony. You must know the story about how there are too many prisoners in England, so they said, let's send them over to Australia. So it began like that. And here to Australia, those people who were able through through suffering, through hard work, through difficulty, to make a very prosperous and stable country. But we would not say prisons are a good thing. Do you know what I mean? So out of history, people can change a bad situation and make it a good situation.
Thank you.
And that's what I would say in that context.
Okay, everybody tired.
I can't bear that.
memory.
是一个是那个 USB， 一个是继续。
Oh. Oh, thank you. That's very kind. So I'll keep this as a souvenir.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, a very special USB, which has that dustle as well. So, thank you so much. Thank you.
The lecture is over. 最差进去了是吧？也可以吗？